Massive stone formations rising along the southern foothills of the Alps had existed in the same silence for centuries. Snowstorms, rain, freezing cold, and thawing seasons had all left their marks on the surface. Yet neither time nor nature had disturbed the order hidden within them. From a distance, they appeared primitive, heavy, almost crude. But up close, they carried an unsettling precision. For generations, people gave these structures familiar names: ceremonial grounds, sacred sites, tombs, monumental constructions said to house the god-kings of a forgotten civilization. The explanation was accepted not because it was proven, but because it was old, and history, once questioned, stopped feeling safe. Elias Rowan was 6 years old when he first studied the stones. He was small, his steps short, but his gaze was careful. He noticed what adults overlooked. Where others saw something sacred, Elias sensed a system, a repetition, a logic. These structures did not feel random. Elias did not see tombs, he saw proportions. The arrangement of the stone blocks did not resemble the work of nature. Central corridors intersected at exact angles. Walls were calculated to endure centuries. Ventilation shafts were not accidental gaps, but carefully positioned according to precise geometry. And at certain times of the year, these channels aligned with specific stars in the sky. This could not be symbolic decoration. Elias had grown up at excavation sites. His mother, Dr. Mara Rowan, was an architect specializing in the structural analysis of ancient buildings. Toys had never interested him. Her drawings, plans, sections, measurements were his world. He would sit beneath the table, tracing lines with his finger, memorizing columns, voids, transitions, and every time he reached the same conclusion. These structures were not built to store something. They were built to do something. The most disturbing detail was what was missing. If this was truly a royal burial site, where were the sacred inscriptions? Where were the reliefs depicting offerings? The journey after death. Symbols common in later tombs were almost entirely absent here. The silence was too organized. One late afternoon, as the excavation site grew quiet, Elias moved toward a narrow passage. On the maps, it was marked as insignificant. But Elias had learned that the areas labeled unimportant often held the deepest secrets. As he stepped inside, the air changed. Sounds echoed differently. His footsteps did not return the way he expected. The stone was vibrating. This was not an earthquake. It was constant, low frequency, rhythmic. Elias stopped, closed his eyes, and listened. The vibration was not heard. It was felt, through the body. The mountain was alive. A single question formed in his mind, simple and dangerous. If this was a tomb, why was it still functioning? The thought threatened more than history books. It challenged the safe story humanity told itself about the past. Elias did not yet understand the consequences, but he was certain of one thing. These stones did not belong to the dead. They were still active. He could not explain the sensation, but a strange alertness moved through his body, as if the structure was observing him, measuring him, responding in silence. The cold of the stone traveled upward from his feet, slowing his heartbeat. Elias knew this was not fear. It was familiar, a call he did not yet have words for. He felt drawn deeper inside, as if remembering something he had never learned, as if the order within the stone was an echo of an ancient knowledge. This moment was beyond curiosity. Without realizing it, Elias had begun a journey. And like all journeys, it marked a threshold, one that could not be crossed back. What he discovered inside the mountain that day would change the course of his life, quietly placing the deepest questions of history into the hands of a child. This was only the beginning. The memory of the stone had awakened, and it was calling Elias deeper, with silent determination. For Elias Rowan, Untersberg was never just a mountain. It was an extension of his childhood. Other children remembered parks, streets, the living rooms of their homes. Elias remembered stone dust, cold metal railings, and echoing galleries. The excavation site was his playground. Silence was his closest companion. His mother, Dr. Mara Rowan, had always been slightly uneasy about how accustomed her son had become to this environment, but keeping Elias away from the site was nearly impossible. He had grown up here. From the day he was born, he was surrounded by maps, measuring instruments, and partially collapsed corridors. For Mara, this place was a workplace. For Elias, it was a living organism. Mara was known for her precision in her profession. She deliberately avoided romantic interpretations of ancient structures. To her, every building was a problem, something measurable, solvable, explainable. She preferred understanding over sanctifying history. This set her apart from many of her colleagues, yet she was careful never to step outside accepted academic boundaries. Elias, however, recognized no such boundaries. When he looked at the plans on his mother's desk, he felt they were more than drawings. They were maps, but not of space, of function. The sectional diagrams of the central structure fascinated him most. The placement of load-bearing columns, the distribution of voids, the positioning of channels, none of it was decorative. One day, when his mother wasn't looking, Elias spread one of the plans across the floor. He traced the lines with his fingers. Then he stopped. The same measurement appeared again, and again, and once more. There was a rhythm. Elias couldn't put it into words, but he sensed it intuitively. The structure wasn't designed merely to stand. The cavities and channels inside it served a flow. But what kind of flow? Air, sound, or something else entirely? The adults at the excavation site saw Elias's interest as innocent curiosity. Children were imaginative, after all. But Elias's questions were different. He didn't only ask why, he asked how and what does it do. One day, he came across old seismic measurement records from the site. The documents belonged to a Japanese drilling survey conducted years earlier. At first glance, the data seemed irregular, but Elias noticed the harmony within the numbers. Certain values repeated, rising and falling at fixed intervals. This was not an error. It was a response. Elias began to understand that something inside the mountain was still answering. The structure was not indifferent to the world around it. A hidden order existed within, and that order was still active. At first, his mother listened to his observations with a gentle smile. But when Elias began repeating the same conclusions again and again, a quiet unease settled in Mara's mind. Because some of the points Elias highlighted aligned disturbingly well with her own observations, and that raised a possibility she did not want to accept. What if this structure was not a tomb at all? What if history had been standing on a false assumption for far too long? For Mara, this thought was dangerous. Because beneath this mountain, it wasn't only stone that was buried, but careers, reputations, and academic certainties. And Elias, without realizing it, was beginning to disturb that fragile silence. Whatever lay beneath the mountain was not merely an ancient secret. That secret was still breathing. There was one thing about the Untersberg formation that had never changed across generations: interpretation. Within the academic world, the structures inside the mountain were not open to debate. They were ceremonial tombs. This view appeared in textbooks, was repeated at conferences, and went unquestioned in every serious publication. Not because it was proven beyond doubt, but because it was backed by authority. That authority had a name: Professor Klaus Reinhardt. Reinhardt was one of Germany's most respected archaeologists. His opinions shaped not only academic papers, but funding decisions and excavation permits. Nearly every serious study written about Untersberg in one way or another relied on his interpretations. To Reinhardt, the structures were tombs, period. To suggest otherwise was not merely a scientific error, it was professional suicide. Dr. Mara Rowan understood this better than anyone. She had worked alongside Reinhardt for years. She respected him, even admired him in certain areas. But she had also seen how rigid he could be. For Reinhardt, archaeology was not a discipline that tolerated ambiguity. History had to be clear. Definitions could not shift. A structure was either a tomb or it was not. There were no acceptable in-between forms. Mara did not dare voice her son's thoughts openly. Elias's observations were logical, but dangerous. Because they weakened a thesis Reinhardt had defended for decades, and in academia, that was unforgivable. Still, Elias did not stop. One evening, in a back room of the research facility, while his mother was unaware, Elias sifted through old documents. Between dusty shelves were files no one had opened in years, early discovery reports, observations made before modern scanning technologies, hand-drawn sketches from the first researchers. As Elias carefully turned the pages, something caught his attention. A drawing. It did not depict the central gallery, nor the main chamber. It showed an area usually labelled on maps as solid bedrock. Along the margins were explanatory notes, written in Old German, difficult to read. But Elias's eyes were drawn to the symbols. They were not religious symbols. They represented vibration, frequency, wave, direction. Elias's heart began to race. This drawing was a record of an observation no one had taken seriously. More than a century earlier, a researcher had noticed that the structure might serve a functional purpose, but that idea had vanished over time, perhaps deliberately. Elias closed the file and looked around. No one was watching, yet the feeling that settled over him was not just excitement. It was the first shadow of danger. Because information like this, spoken by the wrong person or placed in the wrong hands, tended to disappear. Elias did not tell his mother. Not yet. That night, lying in bed, he thought about the silent order inside the mountain. He now knew that what lay beneath the stone did not belong only to the past. This secret had been carried into the present, and there were those who guarded it. The question was no longer what it was, but why it was being hidden. And Elias did not yet know that the answer to that question would place him on a path from which there was no return. The drawing Elias had found was more than a document. It was like an invisible fracture opened inside the mountain, small, silent, and irreversible. The lines dancing across the yellowed paper were a mysterious map left by a hand centuries ago, but also a key, an invitation, perhaps even a warning. Elias understood that. From that moment on, what he saw when he looked at Untersberg had changed. The surface of the stone was the same, yes, the same grey, the same cold, the same ancient weight. But its meaning had transformed. Every block seemed to fall silent around a function it concealed, as if the mountain were a stone-faced player in a game that had been going on for centuries. And Elias was the first to glimpse its true face. As the days passed, Elias's focus sharpened. He no longer just studied the plans, he assembled them in his mind. Sections, voids, and channels connected, forming a single three-dimensional whole. When he closed his eyes, he could see the mountain's internal anatomy. Corridors, chambers, passages, working in harmony like an orchestra. and the whole served a single purpose: an internal flow, a movement, a cycle, a rhythm. This was not a static structure. It was like a living organism. What that flow was remained unclear, but Elias was now certain of one thing: it had nothing to do with death. You do not bury the dead in a place like this. The dead require silence, stillness. Here everything was dynamic, planned, calculated, too complex for a tomb, too concealed for a monument. So what was it? Dr. Mara Rowan could not fail to notice the change in her son. Elias was quieter, more focused. His questions had grown fewer, his gaze deeper. Children usually asked what they wondered about. They wanted answers immediately. Elias behaved as if he already had them. He was distracted at meals. His room stayed lit late into the night. In the mornings, there was fatigue in his eyes, but also a sharpness in his mind, an almost obsessive clarity. One evening, as they sat in the small kitchen of the research facility, Mara finally asked. Snow was falling outside, the light filtering through the window, casting a soft white glow across the table. What have you been so absorbed in lately? Elias looked up. He hesitated for a moment. There was genuine curiosity in his mother's eyes, but also concern. Then he lowered his gaze back to the drawings on the table. Why is the mountain empty? He asked. Mara flinched. What do you mean? The places that should be graves are empty, Elias said calmly. No decoration, no names, no stories, just structure, walls, passages, measurements, but no people, no ritual. Isn't that strange for a tomb? Mara didn't answer, because it was a thought she herself had been trying to suppress. She had worked in this field for years, and something had always felt missing. But her academic reflex took over. Not everything has to make sense, she said, a hint of defensiveness in her voice. Sometimes things are lost. Records disappear. Time erases them. Elias shook his head. This isn't absence, he said firmly. It's design, a deliberate emptiness, as if nothing was ever meant to be placed there. In that moment, Mara felt the certainty behind her son's words. This wasn't imagination. It was inference, a hypothesis, and it was dangerous, because ideas like this were not welcomed in academia. Challenging established assumptions could end careers. The next day, Mara attended a small academic dinner in Munich. The setting was formal, but the conversation relaxed. Wine, candlelight, polite exchanges. At one point, deliberately avoiding names, she introduced an idea. What if some early structures weren't ritualistic, but functional? She said with a light smile, as if it were a casual thought. What if what we call tombs actually served another purpose? Energy transfer, acoustic experimentation, perhaps even a technology we don't yet understand. The atmosphere at the table shifted instantly. Some smiled, polite but distant. Some changed the subject, talking about the weather. But one person took the idea seriously, Professor Reinhardt. His face was expressionless, but his voice was hard, almost icy. Such speculation, he said slowly, emphasizing every word, is unscientific, and it is dangerous. Ideas like this damage the field and its credibility. We are archaeologists, not writers of fantasy. Mara said nothing, but the message was clear. The silence around the table was heavy. No one met anyone else's eyes. The next morning, Mara received a formal notice. From site administration, no subject line, but the content was easy to guess. Elias was never mentioned directly, yet phrases like speculative approaches, discipline, and institutional responsibility were repeated again and again. Her access to Untersberg would be reviewed, documents audited, permits possibly restricted. Mara's career was on the line, and her son had no idea. That evening, when she returned home, Elias noticed the fatigue in his mother's face. Her shoulders were slumped, her eyes distant. "Did something happen?" he asked carefully. Mara paused. Then she chose honesty. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "some questions have no right time. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed again. You need to understand that." Elias lowered his head. But inside him, something settled. A decision had been made. If these questions could not be asked, he would find the answers himself, outside the system, beyond the rules. That night he took out the old drawing again. Under the desk lamp he studied the paper, scanning every square centimetre. Near the edge of the drawing, almost invisible, was a note. Written in faded ink, worn down by years. An arrow, and a single word, lower axis. It indicated something beneath the main gallery, something not on the maps, something never mentioned in the records. And it was there that the source of the vibration Elias had felt was hidden. A call rising from deep underground, silent but insistent. From this point on, there was no turning back. The fracture had opened, and Elias was determined to look inside, no matter the cost. The words "lower axis" echoed relentlessly in Elias's mind. That single phrase pulled together every scattered fragment that had been circling his thoughts for weeks. The central gallery, the main halls, the voids classified as ceremonial. All of them were above, all of them visible, documented, categorized, interpreted. But if there truly was a function, it could not exist in plain sight. It had to be hidden. Deep below, in silence, isolated from the world, beneath layers of protective stone, far from human urgency and academic prejudice. Elias returned to the maps. Modern scans labeled everything beneath the primary structures as solid bedrock. For researchers, this was usually the end of inquiry. Solid rock meant irrelevant, unexcavatable, uninteresting. But to Elias, it meant something else entirely. A void. Because the lines in the old drawing ran directly through that zone. Thin, continuous lines, deliberate, planned, as if someone, centuries ago, had seen or known something modern technology could not detect. That contradiction was the strongest evidence of all. Modern science said nothing was there. The old drawing said something was, and Elias had already chosen which one to trust. For days, he quietly studied the oldest documents in his mother's office. Not all of them, only the earliest. Modern reports were filled with conclusions, written with confidence, with certainty, sometimes with arrogance. The early notes were different, more honest, less sure. Some asked questions, some acknowledged contradictions, and questions mattered more than answers, because questions searched for truth. Answers often sealed it away. In one report, a single sentence caught his attention. Acoustic feedback measured at lower levels is independent of the upper structures. It wasn't underlined. No comment followed. As if whoever had written it hadn't grasped its importance and then forgot it. But to Elias, it was invaluable. It meant the vibration wasn't coming from above. Not from walls, not from ceilings, not from surface structures. It was coming from below, from deep underground, from somewhere not recorded, the lower axis. Elias was certain now. The heart of the structure lay exactly where everyone had chosen not to look, like a human heart, hidden, protected, but essential. Reaching it would not be easy. Access to unmapped areas was forbidden. Cameras, sensors, and regular patrols monitored the facility. Every corner was watched, every movement recorded. Being a child made Elias less visible, but not invisible. A careful adult would notice. One mistake could end everything. his mother's career, his access, and perhaps the chance to uncover the truth at all. So he waited. Patience was Elias's greatest strength, an unnatural patience for a 12-year-old. He had learned the mountain's rhythm, shift changes, camera rotation angles, the moments when guards stepped away for breaks. He knew them by heart. Days were busy, nights were quiet, and after midnight, the sight nearly fell asleep. The sensors stayed alert. Human attention did not. Fatigue, routine, and expectation created the best cover. One night, when the moon slipped behind the clouds, Elias made his decision. He packed only what was necessary, a small flashlight, a copy of the old drawing, and a simple measuring device taken from his mother's desk. He didn't fully understand how it worked, but he knew it detected vibration. He brought no food, no spare clothes. This wasn't an expedition. It was a confirmation run. Go in. Measure. Come back. Simple. Controlled. At least in theory. When he reached the excavation site, the air was sharp and cold. The stone had long since released the day's warmth, and glacial wind swept down the mountain slopes. Elias followed familiar paths toward a partially sealed area near the main gallery. It had been opened temporarily during drainage work, and never properly closed. The warning sign was still there. Restricted area, no entry. But the opening remained, and no one was watching. No one cared, which made it perfect. Elias crouched, slipped through a narrow gap, and reached a natural fissure descending into the mountain. Officially, this zone was classified as inaccessible, but it fit Elias perfectly. Too tight for adults. Possibly impossible. For a child, it was just enough, almost inviting. As he moved deeper, the air changed. Heavier, colder. Each breath required effort, and the vibration grew clearer. Beneath his feet, barely perceptible but steady, was a rhythmic pulse. Regular, constant. Above, the vibration had been an echo. Here, it was a source. The lower axis was here. Elias stopped. For a moment, he considered turning back. His mother's face surfaced in his mind. Her exhaustion. The weight she carried without knowing her career was already at risk. The warnings. The quiet threats. Professor Reinhardt's cold stare. But turning back now meant leaving the truth unfinished. Opening the door, but refusing to step through it. And Elias knew that was impossible for him. He took a deep breath and continued downward. Each step carried him farther from the surface. Each step moved him closer to the unknown. He was no longer just observing. He had crossed the threshold. And what waited beyond it, no one yet knew. As Elias moved closer to the lower axis, his perception began to shift. This place was nothing like the familiar order of the main galleries above. The upper corridors carried the marks of history, centuries of erosion, nature's interference, the uneven traces left by human hands. But this was different. The walls here were smoother. The surfaces showed none of the chaotic fractures left by natural breaks. Instead, they looked deliberately worked. Every plane was calculated, every corner precise and purposeful. The stone here was not merely excavated, it had been directed, shaped, tuned, like the interior of an instrument, adjusted for vibration and flow. Elias placed each step carefully. The ground sloped gently and was damp, but the moisture did not resemble natural seepage. There were no random stains from dripping water. It was orderly, controlled, as if something had once flowed through this space, perhaps water, perhaps something else, and had later been deliberately stopped or redirected. The stone beneath his shoes was wet, but not slippery, as though the moisture had been absorbed into the surface itself. The vibration was clearer here. Above, it had been like a whisper, distant, uncertain, almost imagined. In the lower axis there was a pulse, regular, deep, unbroken, like a heartbeat, but not a human one, slower, steadier, as if it existed outside of time. When Elias placed his hand against the wall, he felt it in his palm. The stone was cold, but not lifeless. There was movement within it, energy, not consciousness perhaps, but awareness. At that moment, something became clear to him. This structure was not made of stone alone. It was a system. Interconnected components, channels, chambers, nodes, all designed to serve a single purpose. But what that purpose was, he still did not know. As he moved forward, the air changed. The oxygen felt denser, yet heavier, as if atmospheric pressure had increased. Elias's breathing slowed. Each breath had to be taken deliberately, consciously. Sound nearly vanished. He could barely hear his own footsteps. Above, sounds echoed and multiplied. Down here, it was the opposite. This was a space that absorbed sound, an acoustic void, a black hole for waves, capturing them, swallowing them, storing them somewhere within. This had to be the place mentioned in the old drawing, the threshold of silence. Elias stopped and took out the measuring device. It was simple, not professional equipment. An old vibration meter his mother used in laboratory work, rarely in the field. But the needle was trembling. The readings were not stable. They rose, then fell, at irregular intervals. There was a rhythm. This was not random motion. It was a cycle, as if the structure itself was breathing. Elias knelt and placed the drawing on the ground. The lines on the paper aligned perfectly with his location. Intersecting paths marked exactly where he stood. One point, in particular, stood out. It was labeled simply as transition. At first glance, it appeared to be a natural void, but Elias understood what it really was. Not an architectural boundary, but a functional one. A threshold, a gate, perhaps even a control point. At that moment, the vibration changed. The pulse accelerated, slightly, but unmistakably, as if something had awakened. Elias froze. His heart began to race. For an instant, he considered retreating, running back, climbing upward, returning to safety. But then he realized something. The change was a response to him. When he moved, the vibration answered. When he stopped, it slowed. When he advanced, it intensified. The structure was sensing entry. The thought was terrifying, but also confirming, because this was something a tomb could never do. This system was still active, even after thousands of years. Elias stood before the transition. Ahead of him was a narrow opening. Not quite a door, more like a natural fissure, but its edges were far too smooth. The interior was dark, but not blind. Even without turning on his flashlight, he could see a faint reflection. The stone inside was different, smoother, darker, almost glass-like. Basalt, he had learned about it in school. Volcanic rock, dense, hard, resistant. This material was never chosen by accident. It withstood heat, pressure, and vibration. Its structural integrity endured for centuries. If this were an ordinary tomb, such complexity would be unnecessary. But if this was an energy chamber, a resonance node, a transfer station, then basalt was the perfect choice. Elias took a deep breath and stepped inside. The space beyond was small, but deliberate. The ceiling was low, nearly matching his height. An adult would not be comfortable here, but for a child it was enough. The walls were covered in complex geometric markings. They resembled neither writing nor decoration. They were too regular, repetitive, yet varied. Elias understood immediately. These were not symbols. They were not language. They were indicators, flow directions, reflections, points of refraction, like a modern circuit diagram etched into stone. Every line carried function, every intersection marked a decision point. This chamber was not a passage, it was a control space, a node, perhaps the brain of the entire system. Elias's heart pounded, not with panic, but with intensity. Discovery, adrenaline, curiosity, and something deeper. Instinctive, he was certain now. This structure was not merely a remnant of the past. It was a technology, ancient but sophisticated, forgotten but functional. This was a mechanism that still operated, and Elias had crossed the threshold. He was no longer an observer. He was inside the system, and the system had noticed him. The moment Elias stepped into the control space, his senses sharpened. This place felt detached from the rest of the mountain. Physically it was connected, stone to stone, passage to passage, but energetically it was isolated. The silence was still there, but it was no longer empty. Empty silence is merely the absence of sound. This silence was something else entirely. It was full. A vibration moved through the air, unheard yet unmistakably felt. Elias knew this was not sound. It was what came before sound. Raw, unprocessed, a pure frequency. Communication not designed for ears but for bones. He moved closer to the geometric markings on the walls. As his flashlight glided across the surface, he noticed their depth. These shapes were not carved. They were not cut by sharp tools. It was as if the stone itself had pushed them outward from within, like a natural growth, or a relief formed by internal pressure. When Elias placed his fingers along one of the lines, the vibration intensified. He felt warmth, very faint but undeniable. The stone was responding to his touch, to his presence, perhaps even to his intent. Elias etched this moment into his memory, because this was where theory became evidence. He was no longer speculating, no longer relying on drawings or notes. The structure was reacting physically, in real time, repeatable, measurable. This was not something a tomb could do. This was what a machine did. A system, a living mechanism. Despite its small size, the chamber was in perfect balance. The floor was perfectly level, not even a millimeter of deviation. The walls angled toward an invisible central point. The distances and angles between them were exactly equal. Elias realized this was not a passage, but a calibration point. A valve, a modulator, as if something coming from above, energy, vibration, or something he could not yet name, was being regulated here, filtered, tuned, then transmitted deeper into the mountain. But what was this something? Acoustic energy, electromagnetic fields, geological stress, or a force entirely unknown, unnamed, unclassified? Elias took out the measuring device again. As he moved closer to the center of the room, the needle oscillated faster. The amplitude increased. Then, at a precise point, it stabilized. The vibration remained, but it no longer changed. This was a threshold value, no excess, no deficiency. The system was self-regulating, perfect balance, homeostatic balance. Elias understood what this meant. The structure did not simply transmit environmental vibrations as they were. It transformed them, adjusted them, organized them, then sent them onward in a specific format. This was not primitive technology. It was the product of an advanced understanding of nature itself, acoustics, geometry, material science, all brought together for a single purpose. Suddenly, the vibration from beneath the floor grew stronger, as if the system were responding to his focused attention. Elias crouched and pressed his ear close to the stone. The cold surface touched his cheek, and then he felt it. A rhythm, not irregular, not chaotic, slow, deep, continuous, like a metronome, but organic, like a heartbeat rising from within the mountain itself. Boom, 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 every few seconds, or perhaps longer. Time had lost its meaning. Without realizing it, Elias's breathing began to synchronize. His lungs expanded and contracted in rhythm. His body was aligning with the system. The stone was singing. But this song was not for the ears. It was for the body, for bones, for cells, perhaps even deeper, for the subconscious. Elias pulled back. His head felt light, his focus blurred, and yet sharpened at the same time. A paradox. He knew he could not go further. Not yet. Because he understood something crucial. This structure was not merely functioning. It was being controlled. It did not operate on its own. Parameters had been set, thresholds defined, and control always required intent, purpose, will. Someone knew this system, and someone was protecting it. The thought sent a chill through him. If this structure had been operating silently for thousands of years, then those aware of it might have existed just as long. A continuity absent from history books, a duty passed down through generations, perhaps a cult, perhaps a sect, perhaps only a lineage, but whatever it was a chain of will, hidden, unspoken, unrecorded. Guardians. The word formed clearly in Elias's mind. He didn't know who they were, how many there were, what they wanted, or why. But he felt their presence, not in the room itself, but in the system's condition. This structure was not abandoned. It was maintained, protected, and Elias was an intruder. On one wall, he noticed a small protrusion, almost invisible. It looked like a broken fragment, but it had been left deliberately. Perhaps it had fallen from a fissure. Perhaps it was a sample. He bent down and examined it closely. This piece was different. Its surface was smoother, brighter. Inside were tiny crystalline structures. They refracted and reflected light. Quartz. Elias understood immediately. This fragment had not fallen by chance. It was part of the system. Perhaps a resonator, perhaps an energy concentrator. He slipped it into his pocket. It was almost weightless, but its significance was heavy. This small fragment was evidence, proof capable of shaking the academic world, if it reached the right hands, if it was explained correctly, if anyone believed it. Now he had to leave. But something had changed. Elias had entered this place as a child, curious, naive, perhaps too imaginative. He would leave it as the bearer of a secret, and secrets carried weight. They isolated. They turned into responsibility. He could no longer return to an ordinary life. He could no longer ignore what he had seen. He could no longer remain silent. As the stone song echoed behind him, Elias moved toward the narrow passage. His steps were slow, but resolute, and deep inside, he knew this would not be his last visit. The door had been opened, and doors opened once are rarely closed again. This had only been the first listening, and the song was far from over. As Elias crawled back through the narrow passage, the stone song slowly began to fade. The vibration was still there, but it was moving away from the center. This made him realize that the system was not only active, but responsive, as if the structure knew where he was and adjusted accordingly. He tried to push the thought aside. Right now, there was only one priority: reaching the surface without being seen. As the passage narrowed, the air grew drier. The silence returned, but now it felt familiar. Elias's heart was still racing, not from fear, but because part of his mind was still inside the control space. He didn't want to let go of what he had seen, of what he had felt. When he emerged, the excavation site was dark. The lights were off. Only the dim glow of the distant security booth remained. Elias stayed completely still for several minutes. He listened. No footsteps. Not even the familiar clicks of the sound sensors. That was a good sign. As he slipped out into the open air, the cold hit his face sharply, snapping him back into the present. The world above the mountain was entirely different from the one below. Up here, everything was static. Down there, a system was operating. Elias moved slowly toward the rear of the facility. He deliberately chose a winding route back. If someone was watching, he didn't want to create a direct trace. The instinct surprised him. He had never needed to hide before. But now he understood. Some knowledge could not be carried openly. That night he couldn't sleep. When he closed his eyes, he saw the stone's surface again. The geometric markings, the pulse-like vibration. The rhythm felt as if it were still inside his body. He tried to slow his breathing, but his heart refused to release the mountain's tempo. He took the small quartz fragment from his pocket and held it in his palm. It was cold, but vibrating. Very faintly, almost like an illusion. Almost. But it was real, and this small piece was proof of what he had seen and what he had felt. Elias realized something important. He couldn't show this evidence to anyone yet, not even to his mother. No matter how open-minded she was, this knowledge would become a burden for her. Her career was already balanced on a fragile line. Elias wanted to protect her. And there was something else. If this structure was truly being controlled, then there were people who knew about it, and those people would not welcome a child's discovery. The next day, Elias tried to behave normally. He was quiet at breakfast. He went to school. In class, he filled his notebook with drawings, but they weren't houses or people. They were circles, axes, flows. His teacher noticed, but said nothing. From that moment on, Elias lived between two worlds, the world above, of rules, silent assumptions, and repeated explanations, and the world below, of functioning, breathing, hidden reality. A line separated those two worlds, and Elias had crossed it. He had withdrawn, yes, but he had not given up. Now he knew what he was looking for, and he also knew that his next step would have to be taken far more carefully. The days following Elias's discovery passed quietly, at least on the surface. The excavation site functioned as it always had. Teams arrived in the mornings. Measurements were taken. Photographs captured. Reports written. Visitor groups were guided along predetermined routes: the entrance gallery, the main hall, the ceremonial zone, and the exit. Every step was scripted. Every explanation approved. Everything looked normal. Routines continued uninterrupted. People moved by habit. But for Elias, that normality had become a mask. Thin, fragile, intentional, because nothing that was happening below appeared in any report. After school, Elias often stopped by his mother's office. A small, narrow room, shelves packed with books, maps covering the walls, stacks of documents on the desk. He would sit quietly, pretending to draw. Scribbles, geometric shapes, random notes. But in reality, he was listening. He noticed tones, pauses, the words people avoided, who lowered their voice, after which topics, who avoided eye contact when certain subjects came up. Lately, words like access, control, and boundary surfaced more often, and every time they were spoken, they carried a particular weight. This was no coincidence. It was a sign of change. One afternoon, while Mara was in her office, the door opened suddenly. There was no knock. Two administrators stepped inside. They weren't formal, no suits, no ties, but they weren't relaxed either. Tablets in their hands, expressions vague but firm. The conversation was brief. 3 minutes, perhaps 5. Elias couldn't hear every word, but he didn't need to. The expressions were enough. Mara's shoulders tensed. She nodded slightly. She agreed to something, but not willingly. Something was being demanded, and it could not be refused. When they left, Mara exhaled deeply. She stood still for several seconds. Elias looked up. "Is something wrong?" he asked carefully, curious but not anxious. Mara hesitated. Her eyes drifted toward the window. Outside, the sun was setting, the light soft. Then she spoke gently. "Access to certain areas has been restricted," she said slowly. "A temporary measure, for security reasons." Elias smiled inwardly. It wasn't temporary, and it wasn't about security. It was a wall, and walls were not built to protect. They were built to conceal. That evening, Elias examined the quartz fragment again. He rotated it beneath a small desk lamp, studying it from every angle. When he shone a focused beam of light through it, fine lines appeared inside the crystal, invisible in daylight, but glowing under intensity. They weren't random. They refracted at specific angles, not symmetrical, but ordered. Elias drew what he saw, then drew it again, and again. Each time the same pattern emerged, a network, a pathway, a circuit. This fragment was a miniature reflection of the system. Elias was beginning to understand what that meant. The structure didn't operate only at large scale. The same principle applied to its smallest components, a fractal logic. Each part reflected the whole. This was the signature of deliberate engineering. Nature had similar patterns, tree branches, river deltas, lung vessels, but never this precise. Here there was intent. There was design. At the same time, academic pressure was increasing. Mara's schedule was altered. Meetings were cancelled. Others she was no longer invited to. Her name disappeared from updated lists. No official explanation was given, but the message was clear. Reinhardt's name surfaced more often. In corridor whispers, in report citations, in decisions being made. His shadow was heavy, though unseen. Everyone knew what he thought. No one said it aloud, because to say it aloud meant choosing a side, and choosing a side was dangerous. Elias wished his mother didn't feel this pressure, but that was impossible. Mara sensed that her son was hiding something. His silence had changed. It was deeper now, more deliberate. But she didn't ask, because some answers were safer when left unspoken. Sometimes, not knowing was a form of protection, for both sides. One night, Elias stood by the window and looked toward the mountain. In the darkness, Untersberg was silent, its silhouette a black mass against the stars, motionless. But Elias now understood what that silence meant. It was not emptiness. It was suppressed activity, energy held under control, a reality closed off, but not erased. The wall was not only physical, it was mental, cultural, institutional. Only certain ways of thinking about the structure were allowed. There was a narrative, ancient tomb, ritual site, ceremonial structure, and that narrative was protected. Any idea that strayed beyond it was ignored or suppressed, labeled speculative, dismissed as unscientific, and this happened too consistently to be accidental, too organized, too coherent, as if there were a protocol. Elias knew now. The truth was being guarded. But guarding was not always an act of goodwill. Sometimes guarding meant hiding. Sometimes guarding meant control. If the system was still operating, someone might be benefiting from it. Knowledge, power, influence, perhaps all three. And if that was true, then Untersberg was not merely a relic of the past, it was a tool of the present, an ancient technology still in use, quietly, invisibly. The thought sent a chill through Elias, but it also brought clarity. The question was no longer only what the system was, or how it worked, or which principles it followed. The real question was who knew? Who knew about this system? Who had access? Who was protecting it? And why they knew? What was the purpose? What was the intent? Why did this knowledge need to be hidden? The wall had risen, invisible but solid. Yet every wall had a weak point. Every system had a flaw. Every structure had a crack. Elias was determined to find it. And he would. Because there was no turning back now. The secret had chosen him. And he had chosen the secret. Realizing that a wall existed was a turning point for Elias. Because something that needed to be hidden was never insignificant. If the system beneath Untersberg were truly meaningless, ineffective, a dusty curiosity of history, no one would bother to conceal it. No one would restrict access. No one would risk academic careers. But it was being hidden, protected, suppressed, which meant that what lay beneath Untersberg was no longer just a theoretical curiosity. It was an actively guarded reality, alive, functional and valuable, and that meant someone was still watching it, measuring it, controlling it. Elias had begun to feel this, not intuitively, but tangibly. In recent days, the atmosphere at the excavation site had changed. The signs were subtle, easy to miss for anyone ordinary. But Elias was no longer ordinary. The angles of the security cameras were different. Where they once scanned walls, they now monitored passageways. Sensor calibrations had been updated. Threshold values lowered, made more sensitive. Certain corridors were closed without explanation. Tape was stretched across entrances. New signs appeared. Lock systems were replaced. They looked like minor details, but to Elias, they were parts of a whole. Steps in a defensive strategy. The system was protecting itself above ground as well, using human rules, institutional authority, and technological tools. One evening, with the facility nearly empty, Elias found himself alone in his mother's office. Mara was in a meeting, budget discussions, personnel reviews. Elias hadn't listened closely. He opened an old laptop sitting on the desk. The screen lit up slowly, loading an outdated operating system. This computer housed archived seismic data. It was no longer used in official reports. Modern software existed. Faster servers. Most people had abandoned this dataset entirely because it was considered meaningless. Noise, background vibration, statistical deviation. For Elias, it was the opposite. This wasn't noise. The signal was buried inside the noise. He pulled up the data and examined the timeline. At first glance, the values looked chaotic. Rising and falling waves, sudden spikes, long-term drifts. But Elias now knew what to look for. There were small deviations repeating at fixed intervals, extremely subtle, measured in milliseconds. Standard analysis protocols filtered them out automatically. But they were there, and they didn't match natural seismic events. Earthquakes, landslides, ground shifts, all had distinct signatures. These didn't resemble any of them. They looked like responses, warnings, echoes, feedback loops. Elias marked the night of his own descent, entered the date and time. The graph recalculated, and at that exact point, the pattern changed. The vibration surged, forming a sharp peak. Then it stopped, almost completely flatlined, and then it resumed, but at a lower intensity, as if the system had recalibrated itself, adjusted. This confirmed it. The system had reacted to him, and more importantly, it was being monitored, because detecting micro-variations like these required more than sensors, more than algorithms. No automated system could respond with this level of nuance. It required will, decision-making, a human or humans. Elias closed the laptop. His fingers trembled above the keyboard. He didn't want to stay any longer. Seeing too much was dangerous, knowing too much even more so. But just as he was about to shut the lid completely, a notification appeared. A small window, brief, unmistakable. Access log updated. Elias's throat went dry. His heart slammed against his chest. This wasn't a system error. This was a notification, not an automatic log, an alert. It meant someone had noticed the data being accessed. Someone was watching, in real time, or close to it. Elias hadn't altered anything. He hadn't deleted files. He had only looked. That was enough. He had left footprints, digital ones, and they had been recorded. He was no longer invisible. He was no longer just a curious child. He was now a risk factor. That night, when he returned home, he didn't talk much. His mother asked routine questions. How was your day? Do you have homework? But Elias answered in single words. Fine. No. Tired. He went to his room, closed the door, but didn't lock it. Locking would raise suspicion. He stood by the window and looked toward the mountain. Untersberg was dark, but it was no longer empty. Something was happening there, deep below the surface, and whatever it was tightening a circle around him. Invisible, but tangible. Not yet a threat, but a warning, a signal. Elias made a decision. He could no longer remain a passive observer. He could no longer simply listen and take notes. Observation itself had become an action. He had been noticed, logged, watched. If the system was still operating, and if someone was actively monitoring it, then hiding the truth came at a cost. And that cost was not merely academic. This wasn't about careers or reputation. It was about power, about knowledge, about control. And throughout history, power and knowledge had always demanded the same thing: the ability to keep secrets and the willingness to protect them. Elias took the quartz fragment into his hand and closed his fingers around it. The cold stone slowly began to warm. This small object could be the key to a vast system. Physical evidence, tangible, testable, indisputable, and dangerous. Because evidence generated questions. Questions attracted attention, and attention became threat. There was no turning back now. Elias understood what being noticed truly meant. He was no longer anonymous, no longer innocent. He was now seen as a threat, small perhaps, but still a threat. From this point forward, there were only two paths. Either he would reveal the truth completely, or allow the truth to silence him. There was no middle ground. Half-truths were the most dangerous of all. Partial exposure was the riskiest path, and Untersberg watched silently. The stones did not speak, but they vibrated. The system did not sleep, but it remained awake. And deep below, in the lower axis, the pulse continued, waiting for Elias's next move. Realizing that he had been noticed quietly altered Elias's inner world. Before, there had only been questions. Now, there were eyes circling those questions, invisible, but pressing. The system operating beneath Untersberg now had extensions in the world above. This awareness didn't frighten Elias, but it isolated him. As the days passed, small details multiplied. The security guard at the facility entrance now lingered his gaze on Elias a little longer. A camera that had never drawn attention before was now angled towards the door of his mother's office. These were not overt threats. They were warnings. We are here. Elias understood the message clearly. His mother, Mara, sensed that something was wrong as well, but this time it was different. This wasn't academic pressure. It was colder, quieter. Phone calls ended abruptly. Certain emails went unanswered. Reinhardt's name was no longer spoken directly. Instead, vague phrases appeared. An instruction from above. Above. The word echoed in Elias's mind. Who was above? An academic board? The state? Or something else entirely? An authority connected not to institutions, but to the system beneath the mountain? Elias didn't know the answer. But he knew this much. These people felt no need to explain themselves. Their power came from silence. One evening, Mara came home late. She was exhausted. She sat at the table but didn't eat. Elias watched her. The lines on her face had deepened in recent weeks. He didn't want her to carry this burden. "I might not be here for a while," Mara said suddenly. "I've been temporarily reassigned to another project." Elias froze. This wasn't a promotion. It was a removal, carefully packaged but unmistakable. "For how long?" Elias asked. "I don't know," Mara said honestly. "But you won't stay here. You'll come with me." Elias nodded, but something inside him broke, because this meant being pulled away from Untersberg, and whatever lay beneath that mountain had no intention of letting him go. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, staring into the darkness. The quartz fragment was still in his pocket. He took it out and placed it on the table. He turned off the light. As moonlight passed through the crystal, it fractured into fine reflections. And in that moment, Elias realized something. The patterns inside the crystal matched, exactly, the geometries beneath the mountain. This was no coincidence. This was the stone's memory. Elias understood then. The system didn't operate only at large scale. Knowledge had been divided, distributed. The stone itself carried data. This was how the system ensured it could never be destroyed. And now, that knowledge was with Elias. But that also meant risk. Because if the guardians of the system were watching him, then this small fragment in his possession was being watched as well. Perhaps it carried a marker, a signal, something detectable. Elias wrapped the quartz fragment, hid it away. But he knew one thing now. He was not alone. And that might not be a good thing. Eyes had opened, and Untersberg did not easily release those who came to know it. The memory of the stone would not release Elias. Mara's temporary reassignment to another project was, in truth, a separation. It was delivered gently, wrapped in careful language, but its meaning was clear. Untersberg was to be left behind. Elias had learned to recognize the words adults used in situations like this. Temporary often meant indefinite, and uncertainty was always a tool of control. Preparations began quietly. As Mara packed their belongings, she chose not to speak. Elias didn't ask questions, because the answers were already hanging in the air. The silence in the room was no different from the silence beneath the mountain. Here, too, what was left unsaid carried the greatest weight. Elias knew he had to say goodbye. But this would not be a wave of the hand. It was the stretching of a bond, pulled tight, ready to break. And before it broke, there were things that had to be done. On his final night, after everyone else had fallen asleep, Elias slipped quietly out of his room. He placed a few carefully prepared items into his bag, copies of the drawings, the measuring device, and the quartz fragment. He wrapped each one with care. This was not for escape, but for memory. Because memory was the system's weakest point. He did not go to the excavation site. This time he would not descend. There was no need. He understood now. The structure was not bound to a single location. Knowledge was distributed throughout the stone. Axes, passages, and chambers formed a network, and networks were understood not only from their center, but from their nodes. Elias walked toward the rocky path outside the facility. He looked at Untersberg from a distance. The mountain was silent, as always. But Elias knew what that silence meant. It was waiting. It was aware of the departure. The quartz fragment in his pocket had begun to warm slightly. This was no illusion. He had felt it before. The crystal responded to environmental change. Distance itself created a signal. It won't let me go, Elias thought. But this was not fair. It was a contract. The next morning they left. For a long time there was no conversation in the car. Mara glanced at her son in the mirror. Elias's face was calm. But it was not the calm of childhood innocence. It was the calm of a decision made. As the city fell behind them, the rhythm inside Elias shifted. The mountain's pulse was weakening, but it was not disappearing, which meant the connection had not been severed. It had only been stretched, and stretched bonds are more dangerous. Elias thought about the road ahead. He was no longer just an explorer. He was a carrier. What he knew was something others did not want known, and that was a heavy burden for a child his age. But the memory of the stone had chosen him, and choices, once made, were rarely undone. This departure was not an ending. It was the next phase of the system. Untersberg was behind him now, but Elias knew this was only a physical distance. On maps, the mountain may have grown smaller. In his mind, it remained the same size, clearer even, because distance does not always blur things. Sometimes it sharpens them. The new city was quiet, more orderly, more controlled. The streets were straight, the buildings symmetrical. But to Elias, this order was not the same as the order beneath the mountain. This order was imposed by people. Untersberg's had been integrated with nature itself. The difference unsettled him. Mara tried to adapt quickly to the new project. Meetings, plans, new teams, constant distraction. Elias, on the other hand, preferred to be alone. After school, he took long walks. He touched stones. He tried to feel vibrations beneath the ground. And he noticed something unexpected. Everywhere, however faint, the same rhythm existed. It was not the powerful pulse of Untersberg, but it was its echo, as if the mountain didn't function at a single point, but extended into the fabric of the world itself. Elias couldn't yet put this into words, but he could feel it. The system was global. This realization made his burden heavier, because it meant the responsibility was greater than he had imagined. At night, he placed the quartz fragment on his desk and watched it in silence. Sometimes the lines within the crystal became sharper. Sometimes they faded. The changes matched Elias's inner state. The crystal seemed to respond not only to the environment, but to the mind. One night, he opened his sketchbook. He did not draw Untersberg. Instead, he drew a circular network, nodes, axes, flows, and he realized that what he was drawing was far larger than the mountain's plan. This was not a singular system. It was a network. A disturbing thought took hold. What if Untersberg was only one node? What if there were others, elsewhere? The idea was terrifying, but it also explained everything. If the system existed in more than one place, then those who controlled it were not responsible for a single mountain, but for an entire network, and networks are invisible. One evening, Mara noticed Elias's drawings. She studied them for a long time without speaking. Then she asked only one question. "Where did you learn this?" Elias didn't answer right away, because this was not a matter of learning. It was remembering. "Sometimes," he said finally, "you don't learn things. You just recognize them." Mara didn't ask anything more, because the answer had touched something in her as well. That night, when Elias lay in bed, he did not dream of Untersberg. Instead, he saw points of light glowing in the darkness, lights connecting to one another, waves, a silent harmony. The system was no longer calling. It was reminding. And Elias knew this reminder was not temporary. The bond hadn't been broken. It had only spread across a wider field, which meant that leaving Untersberg hadn't made him safer. On the contrary, it had moved him closer to the center. During the weeks spent in the new city, Elias grew accustomed to the rhythm that seemed to follow him. It was like the shadow of the powerful vibration he had felt at Untersberg, weaker, but persistent in a way that was deeply unsettling. Elias could distinguish these things now. It didn't feel like a sound. It felt like a presence. One afternoon, on his way home from school, he slowed to a stop in the middle of the street. It wasn't intentional. His steps simply lost momentum. In that moment, the quartz fragment in his pocket warmed slightly. Elias stopped. He looked around. Nothing appeared out of place. People passed by. Cars stopped and moved on. Everyday life continued. But something had changed. Elias was being watched. The sensation didn't arrive as fear. Instead, it felt like the first sign of an anticipated meeting. Elias closed his hand around the quartz. For a brief instant, the lines inside the crystal sharpened, then faded again. This wasn't a warning. It was an acknowledgement. When he returned home that evening, Mara was waiting for him by the door. Her face was tense, but not panicked. "Someone called me today," she said, "from the old project." Elias said nothing. "They said they wanted to talk," Mara continued. "Just talk." Those words were familiar to Elias. Just talk usually meant drawing a boundary. He nodded. "What did you say?" he asked. "I haven't answered yet," Mara said. "But this isn't a coincidence, is it?" Elias hesitated for a moment. Then he looked up. "No," he said. "It isn't." That night, Elias couldn't sleep for a long time. He sat by the window, watching the flickering light of the street lamps. Untersberg wasn't here, but the network was, and the network was beginning to pull toward him. Suddenly, a clear thought formed in his mind. They wanted contact. That contact didn't have to be threatening. It could even be gentle, because real power wasn't shown by shouting, it was shown by inviting. Elias understood this now. If guardians truly existed, the first step would always be soft. The next day, after school, he deliberately took a longer route home. He passed through a quiet park. An elderly man sitting on a bench caught his attention. The man looked at Elias for a long moment. Then he lowered his head slightly. Elias stopped. This wasn't a glance. It was recognition. The man said nothing. Neither did Elias. But the quartz fragment warmed again. The man stood, walked away slowly, and disappeared from sight. Elias didn't look back, because he was certain now. He wasn't being followed. He was being observed. And this observation wasn't random. It was deliberate. Each step Elias took found a response within the network. Untersberg had only been the beginning. The real question was who had carried this knowledge, and for how long. Elias knew this much now. The encounter was approaching, and that encounter might mark the end of his childhood. Elias sensed that the encounter was approaching. No one had said it aloud, but some things didn't require words. As the days passed, the signs multiplied, pauses that seemed accidental, glances that felt unfamiliar, yet strangely known, and most of all, the quartz fragment responding more frequently. This was not a summons. It was an invitation. Mara noticed the change as well. She silenced her phone more often, ignored certain numbers, cut conversations short in the evenings, watched Elias more closely. But she didn't ask questions, because they both understood now. Some questions, once answered, opened doors that could never be closed again. One morning, They found an unmarked envelope in the mailbox. It had their address, but no sender. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No threat, no explanation, only a date, a time, and a place. An old library in the city centre. When Elias looked at the page, the quartz fragment warmed in his hand. This was confirmation. Whoever had sent the envelope had touched the right point. Mara placed the paper on the table. "We're not going," she said. Her voice was firm, but there was a tremor beneath it. Elias looked up. "We have to go," he said calmly. "They're already here." The sentence cut off Mara's objection. Because Elias was right. Being invited was the next stage of being watched. Refusing wouldn't change anything. It would only hand over control completely. The hours passed slowly that day. Even at school, Elias couldn't focus. The writing on the board blurred. The rhythm pulsed at the back of his mind. It wasn't as powerful as it had been at Untersberg, but it was clearer now, more deliberate. As they walked toward the library in the late afternoon, Elias observed his surroundings carefully. The building was old, stone-faced, heavy doors. Inside it was quiet, but not abandoned. On the contrary, it was meticulously ordered. No one greeted them when they entered. But Elias knew they were in the right place. The quartz fragment was no longer warm. It was steady. This was waiting. They moved toward the reading room at the back. Long tables, tall shelves, dim light. There, seated at one of the tables, was the elderly man Elias had seen in the park. This time he was not alone. 2 others sat beside him, their expressions neutral. The man stood. "We're glad you came," he said. His voice was calm, neither threatening nor welcoming. Elias met his gaze. There was no urgency in those eyes, no fear, only continuity, the quiet weight of a duty carried across centuries. "We don't believe in conversation," the man said. "We believe in balance." The word echoed inside Elias. Balance. That was what he had felt beneath Untersberg, not the stillness of a tomb, but the equilibrium of a system. The man continued. "Some structures are not merely stone, and some knowledge is not stored only in books." Elias stepped forward. "I know," he said. The man nodded. "We know that you know." In that moment, Elias understood that his childhood was truly behind him. This was no longer a discovery. It was a responsibility, and that responsibility had been chosen. The invitation had been accepted, and the silence resting on the table carried the weight of a truth about to unfold. The silence inside the library was heavier than any word spoken. Elias stood at the head of the table, studying the lines on the old man's face. They were not marks of age, but of continuity, traces left by long time spans and repeated decisions. The 2 people beside him remained silent. Their presence framed the moment more than any speech could. "Untersberg," the old man said, choosing the word carefully, "is not an exception." Elias felt his chest tighten. That single sentence confirmed months of intuition. The mountain was not a center. It was a node, part of a network. "People see tombs," the man continued, "because tombs are simple. They have a beginning and an end. Balance, however, requires continuity, maintenance, silence." Mara spoke from her seat. "Who are you?" Her voice was controlled but firm. She was not asking as a mother, but as a professional. The man inclined his head slightly. "Names change," he said. "The duty remains. We do not protect. We adjust." The word struck Elias sharply. Adjust. It was more dangerous than control, because it denied the existence of intervention. "What is being adjusted?" Elias asked. After a brief pause, the man answered. "Vibration, flow, balance, the internal tension of the world." This was the rhythm Elias had felt in the control space. finally given language. The stone's song was no longer a metaphor. It was a process. "These are claims," Mara said, "that require scientific verification." The man smiled faintly. "Of course," he said. "That is why no one is told." Elias stepped forward. He took the quartz fragment from his pocket and placed it on the table. As the light passed through the crystal, fine lines became visible. The man's expression hardened. Emotion flickered across his face for the first time. "Where did you get that?" he asked. "From the lower axis," Elias said. "From the control space." The air in the room shifted. The two people beside the man straightened slightly. This was not a threat. It was confirmation. Elias's words were no longer speculation. The man took a deep breath. "That area," he said, "is restricted." "Not anymore," Elias replied calmly, "because the system is still operating, and someone is using it." The balance at the table broke. The man looked directly at Elias for the first time. "Some truths," he said, "exist so they may remain unknown." Elias shook his head. "No," he said. "Some truths are hidden to keep them out of the wrong hands. That's different." A long silence followed. Then the man spoke again. "This knowledge," he said, "demands a price." Mara immediately intervened. "He's a child." The man did not take his eyes off Elias. "Choice does not consider age," he said. "Burden considers the one who carries it." Elias took the quartz fragment back into his hand. It was warm now. That meant the system was responding. The network was listening. "What do you want from me?" Elias asked. The man answered plainly. "We don't want to silence you," he said. "We want to bind you." This was the most honest sentence Elias had heard all night. Silencing would have been crude. Binding was permanent. "Balance," the man added, "collapses when carried alone." Elias understood. This was not a threat. It was an offer. But refusing it would have consequences. The silence returned to the table, and Elias could now feel the price. As the silence at the table stretched on, Elias understood that this was not waiting. It was measurement. They were not rushing him, because haste was a sign of imbalance. They wanted to see his reaction, not his words, but his stance. Elias held the quartz fragment in his palm. The warmth had stabilized. It neither increased nor faded. Perfectly balanced. This was a form of confirmation, as if the network recognized the moment and was awaiting the outcome. Mara realized she had been holding her breath. She looked at her son. There was no fear on Elias's face. There was hesitation, but no panic. This was one of the hardest moments for her, because she was torn between staying silent to protect him and speaking to protect him. "What does it mean to be bound?" Elias asked. The old man did not answer immediately. "Not to be owned," he said finally. "Not to be directed, but not to be left alone." Elias lowered his head. The sentence sounded almost merciful, but mercy was the softest form of power. "And silence?" Elias asked. This time the man answered directly. "To not tell certain things," he said. "To not place certain things in the wrong hands." Elias smiled inwardly. Wrong hands was always the language of authority. Still, he understood. If this system truly functioned as a global balancing mechanism, uncontrolled exposure could lead to catastrophe. This was not a black and white decision. It was grey. Elias looked down at the table. The heavy wooden surface of the library bore the marks of time. Knowledge had always been kept here, not in the open, but among shelves. These people were doing the same. They were not destroying knowledge. They were limiting its circulation. "What if I refuse?" Elias asked. For the first time, the two people beside the old man moved. The shift was subtle, but Elias noticed it. The man spoke calmly. Then balance will be recalibrated in a way that excludes you. This was not a threat. It was a fact. The network functioned by adaptation, by pushing out what didn't align. Mara could no longer contain herself. "That isn't fair," she said. The man nodded. "Balance does not have to be fair," he said. "It has to be sustainable." Elias engraved the sentence into his mind, because it summarized the system's morality. Not human, functional. For a long moment, no one spoke. Elias closed his eyes. He thought of Untersberg, the lower axis, the threshold of silence, the song of the stone. In that moment, he accepted that carrying this knowledge was not merely a privilege, it was a burden. When he opened his eyes, his decision was clear. "I won't reveal it," he said, "but I won't surrender it either." The old man's eyebrows lifted slightly. This was not the answer he had expected. "I will be bound," Elias continued, "but not blindly. I will learn balance, but you will not be its only keepers." The air in the room tightened. The two beside the man looked to him. The man, however, did not look away from Elias. A long moment passed. Then, slowly, he smiled. "That," he said, "is exactly why we chose you." Elias felt his heart quicken. This was not relief. It was the beginning of a new weight. The choice had been made. But this choice did not end freedom. It made it far more dangerous. When they stepped out of the library, the air was cold. The night felt quieter than usual, even for the city. Streetlights glowed in yellow and white, illuminating the roads. People passed by. Couples, solitary walkers, faces lit by phones. Life continued. Everything looked normal, routine, familiar. But for Elias, the world was no longer the same. The surfaces were unchanged, but their meanings had shifted. Because when certain doors are opened, the world itself does not change. The person does. Perception transforms. What you notice, what you see, what you understand, all become something else. The old man did not extend his hand in farewell. Touch would have created an unnecessary bond. Physical contact left traces. It transferred energy. Instead, he inclined his head slightly. A slow, measured gesture. Not a greeting. Not a claim. A recognition. Not between two people, but between two carriers. Elias was no longer just a child. He was a node in the network. Small, perhaps, but connected. "Balance," the man said one last time, his voice low but clear, "is learned over time." Elias did not answer, because balance was no longer a word. It was no longer an abstract idea. It was a responsibility, a daily practice, a measure at the center of every decision and every choice. Not too open, not too hidden, not too loud, not too silent, not too trusting, not too suspicious. Not a middle ground. A dynamic calibration. They drove in silence for a long time. The engine hummed softly. As the city faded behind them, Elias looked out the window. Street lights fell away, replaced by darkness. The countryside began. Trees, fields, the silhouettes of mountains. This darkness was not filled with the unknown. It was filled with what was hidden. Every dark space carried a secret. Every silence concealed knowledge. And Elias was now aware of it. The world was far more layered than it appeared. When they arrived home, Elias went to his room. Mara said nothing. Perhaps she was exhausted, perhaps lost in thought. Elias closed the door quietly. He placed the quartz fragment on his desk. It looked small, ordinary. Anyone else would have seen only a piece of stone. He turned off the light. The crystal was almost invisible in the darkness. Moonlight seeped faintly through the window, but not enough to reveal its form. Still, Elias knew. Being unseen did not mean being gone. Invisibility was sometimes the strongest form of existence. That night, he dreamed of Untersberg, but this time the mountain was not silent. It was not still. There was a living order within it. Vibrations, pulses, axes, channels, chambers, everything moving in harmony, like an orchestra. But there was no conductor. Or perhaps the conductor was the mountain itself. This harmony was not bound to a center, but to memory. The stone remembered what had happened, who had entered, who had left, who had listened, who had touched, who had taken, who had carried, and now Elias was part of that memory, recorded, noted, recognized. When he woke in the morning, the quartz fragment was cold. It did not respond. It did not vibrate. Even when light touched it, the patterns he had seen the night before were gone. That meant the system was not watching him constantly. The network spoke only when necessary. Energy efficiency, discretion, secrecy. And from this, Elias learned something essential. True control did not rely on constant pressure. It did not require continuous surveillance. It only needed to be felt, to be known. And that knowledge was enough. Days passed. Life pretended to return to normal. School, home, routine, lessons, homework, dinners. But Elias now lived in a layered world, the visible world and the felt one, surface and depth, what was said and what was understood without words. And the felt world was more enduring, more real, because the visible world could change, people could lie, systems could collapse, narratives could be rewritten. But the felt world was internal, carried, protected. Elias learned to listen, not just to words, but to tone, to pauses, to silence, to wait, to not rush, to recognize the right moment, to remain quiet, to speak only when necessary, to avoid drawing attention, and above all, to remember every detail, every contradiction, every pattern. He was building an archive in his mind, not written, not digital, unerasable, because this was the system's greatest weakness. Information could be written, stored on paper, on servers, on disks. It could be erased, with a button, with fire, with a decision. It could be hidden, access restricted, files lost. But memory, once carried, could not be destroyed. The brain could not be hacked. The mind had no access control. As long as a person lived, their memories lived with them. Elias had accepted this burden. But it was not submission, not surrender. It was balance. To be part of the network did not mean owning it. It meant sharing without dispersing, protecting without locking away. And Elias had chosen this consciously. He had not been forced. He had not been persuaded. It was his decision, and that gave him strength. Untersberg was still there, on the horizon, silent, powerful, waiting, a black mass in the night, a grey giant in daylight, unchanged, constant, enduring. But it was no longer alone, because the memory of the stone continued to live inside the mind of a child, and that memory was neither fully hidden nor fully revealed. It was not written in an academic report, nor forgotten. It existed in between, known but not known, carried but not spread, waiting for the right moment, patiently, silently, ready. And one day, when balance was threatened again, and it would be, because power was always in flux, the stone would sing once more. It would vibrate. It would call. This time there was someone who understood, someone who listened, someone who remembered, someone who carried. And that changed everything. Because secrets were powerful only when they were hidden. But when they were shared, they became immortal. Elias stood by the window. He looked toward the mountain. He said nothing. But inside, silently, He made a promise. "I will remember." And as if in response, a faint wind moved through the night. Stone and child were now bound. The end.